And Maryland C. Evening, church.
Good evening.
Y'all doing all right? Beautiful weather the last couple of days, wasn't it? I think about a month today. I'm one of those people that gets depressed when it's cloudy over the weekend, so I love it. Not you, huh? Now some people like the cloudy weather, but I like the sun. All right, we come, reading through the book of Revelation, we come to one of the probably most popular or infamous characters, depending on how you want to characterize it, in all the Bible. And we usually call him the Antichrist. So before we open up our Bibles and read, let me ask you, in case you already know, who is the Antichrist? Yeah, you got to finish there. Chuck Schumer. Well, this could be a little route. Okay.
When the late great planet Earth came out, it was Henry
Henry
Kissinger.
Kissinger. Yeah. A lot of people think it would be a Jew. And back when Luther was alive, they all thought it was going to be the Pope. So it's the church's ideas about who the Antichrist is or might be are fascinating subjects in itself. Anybody else got it figured out? Yeah. All right, John?
I've kind of always been under the assumption that even Satan himself don't know who it's going to be because he doesn't know the day that the Lord's coming back either.
Okay, well, that's a good
So
point.
that he
If
probably-
nobody knows when the Lord's coming back,
He
then how can
probably
Satan
has someone on earth at all time that could step into that
Okay,
whenever the time comes.
that's a good point. And actually, John in the New Testament, in 1 John, speaks of antichrists in the plural. And he says that in the first century, antichrists were already operative in the world. But Paul writing in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 speaks of somebody called the man of lawlessness, who it seems reasonable to equate this man of lawlessness with the person that we're going to look at tonight, and with the idea of Antichrist. Because John, even though he says there were antichrists, he also says that there's one coming who will sort of fulfill all of the evil, the wickedness in one individual. So that's interesting what you said, John. It's almost like there have been evil individuals throughout history who were kind of putting up their resume to be the Antichrist, but so far nobody's been hired yet.
It could have been that guy if it had happened at that time.
At that time, right. And that's one of the fascinating things about the book of Revelation is that it seems so imminent no matter when you read it. People in the first century thought, well, this is what's about to happen. People 1,500 years later, but 500 years ago, from our perspective, also thought this is about to happen. When we read it, we think, well, this is about to happen. And it really feels that way. And it did to them as well. I think so. I've said before, imagine yourself given a writing assignment. And the writing assignment is that you write a short book, but one of significant length, that would be read by anybody, anywhere, at any time, and they would think that you were writing about them and their time. There's not many people who could do that. In fact, I would think there's only one who could do that. And only God himself could write such a book. And that's one of the things that makes the book of Revelation just appear very miraculous. It's in a category all by itself when it comes to literature. But we come to this character tonight called the Antichrist, and another interesting thing is that the word Antichrist doesn't even occur in the entire book of Revelation. And yet the description just seems so rich with details that nobody even really questions the identity of this person. In fact, in the book of Revelation, the Antichrist is called what? The Beast. And we get another famous or well-known figure from that, which is the mark of the beast that everybody talks about, the number 666, which is at the end of this chapter. But this brings up a subject, though, that is pertinent to what Jesus said this morning. Jesus' statement about giving Caesar what is Caesar's and God what is God's lays the foundation for the separation of church and state, which would be operative throughout the church age, and still is now, and has been abused by both the church and the state at many different times. But that raises questions. If we are people who have dual citizenship, and all Christians have dual citizenship, we are citizens of the nation in which we live, which would for us be the United States of America, but we are also, our primary citizenship is the kingdom of God. And so we have to exist, learn to exist as those who have, in a sense, divided loyalties. We want to understand what it means to be loyal to our nation, but to do so in a way that doesn't detract from our primary loyalty, which is to the kingdom of God. Now, inevitably, what's going to happen? There's going to be conflict, and Jesus, of course, didn't address that when he laid out the principle in his statement this morning. And to address that is very detailed because the conflicts are going to be different depending on where you are and what time of history that you're in. But the beast, the Antichrist, represents, in a sense, the ultimate conflict between being a citizen of heaven and a citizen of what appears from the book of Revelation to be the idea of a citizen of earth. Because it really looks like, and I freely admit that I, like everyone else who reads the book of Revelation, I do so from a perspective. It's the perspective of 2019 South Arkansas, the world that we live in today. There's no way that we can completely remove ourselves from our perspective to try to read the Bible. We want to be as objective as possible, but even if we could do that, I'm not sure if we would want to, because the Bible needs to be applicable to our situation. Nevertheless, the fact that we have this set of facts and circumstances that we live in, that we use to interpret everything that we see, including what we read in the Bible, could change what we see. But I don't think so, and I'm not the first one to say that. But here's what it looks like to me. It looks like that the materials we're about to read tell us that there's a time coming when the world will be united under one head. That nations will, in some sense, cease to exist. Now, they may still be there on some level, but there will be a centralized power that this Antichrist or beast will take control of. Now, to me, again, I admit that I'm looking at things from my perspective, but I can't help but do so. And from my perspective, when I look at what's happening in the world today, I see exactly that very thing. If not happening, at least getting set up to happen. The idea that there would be no borders, no nations, that there would be these worldwide organizations who have actual authority over all peoples, and that would set up a political entity that a strong leader could come into and take control over and literally control the entire world. As crazy as that may sound, and it probably sounded pretty crazy in the first century, but it looks more and more possible. Although, even in the first century, Rome seemed like they were going to do that. But ever since then, everyone who's tried to put together a big coalition like that, eventually what happens? It crumbles. It falls apart. Usually it decays from within. The Bible seems to be saying to us that eventually somebody's going to make it work for a very short period of time. So let's open up to Revelation chapter 13 and read a few verses from this chapter. Right away, in transitioning from Revelation 12 to Revelation 13, there's a minor textual issue that we at least have to note before we move on. In the Bible that I'm looking at, there is a chapter 12 and verse 18. Your Bible may not have a chapter 12 and verse 18. If you're looking at a New International Version, they have taken the words that are in chapter 12, verse 18, and they've included them in chapter 13, verse 1. It is just that phrase that says, and mine says, he stood on the sand of the sea. It's just that one little phrase. He stood on the sand of the sea. Should it be the end of 12? Should it be the beginning of 13? That's really neither here nor there. A more important question is, should it be, and he, the dragon from the previous verse, stood on the sand of the sea, or I stood on the sand of the sea? Anybody have one that says, and I stood? Okay. Now, what's happening there is the word is estaphe. Estaphe means he stood. But there are some ancient manuscripts that have estaphe. The only difference between those two words is a new or an in English added on the end. It's either estaphe or estaphane. If it's estaphe, it's he stood. If it's estaphane, it's I stood. It's a very, very difficult question to answer definitively. But it seems better that we should take it as a stop that. It seems more natural that somebody along the way would have added the in and they would have taken it out. Either way, it doesn't change the meaning of what we're reading significantly. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I'm just curious because it says that the dragon stood up and the sea, and then I saw.
Exactly, and that's probably why but that's not unusual in these visions.
Okay, so.
It really could go either way. It really could go either way. So we get to chapter 13 to where it says, I saw. And of course, John is the speaker here. He's the one seeing this panorama of spiritual activity, both in the heavens and on the earth. And in verse 13 he says, and I saw from the sea a beast rising up, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on his horns 10 diadems, and on his head a name of blasphemy, or names of blasphemy. Now, this is not the first time that the beast has occurred. Actually, the beast has already been introduced in the book of Revelation. I'm curious to know if anybody remembers where it was. Okay, it was in chapter 11. Do you remember the 2 witnesses in chapter 11 that God sends to earth with great power? They're kind of like an Elijah, Moses type. And they minister for a while, and then they're destroyed. They're destroyed by the beast. So that's the introduction in the book of Revelation to the beast. Interestingly, in chapter 11, when he's mentioned for the first time, he is mentioned as the beast. And so the connotation is that there's only one of these. This is somebody special. This is that final Antichrist that everybody is expecting that will come. This is not one of the sub-Antichrists or the wannabes. This is the real guy. It also implies that the actions that took place in chapter 11 took place at the same time as these actions here in chapter 13. And so again, seems to have pretty solid evidence that John is using, or Jesus as he gives the visions to John, some kind of recapitulation in the sequence of all of this. That he shows John some things, and then he backs up in the story and shows them from another perspective. If you look back at chapter 12, verse 17, it says that the dragon was enraged at the woman and went out to make war with the rest of her seed, those keeping the commandments of God and those holding the testimony of Jesus. Chapter 13 seems to be an unfolding of that verse. And so that verse gives us the summary. Chapter 13 gives us the details. All right, back to verse 1. So he comes out of the sea. What might the sea represent? It could be literal. He comes literally out of the sea. Or the sea might represent something else. What could that be? Anybody know? Okay, that's exactly right, Alan. In the Old Testament, the sea was used metaphorically or symbolically as the primeval chaos of wickedness. When they looked out at the sea, they saw it as a manifestation of the depth and the chaotic idea of wickedness. And so it could be used in that sense. Somebody else?
The Gentile, being from the Gentile nation.
It could mean just the peoples of the earth, the cauldron of humanity, if you will, that he comes up out of all of that. And that's probably the best way to take this, because in chapter 17, that's the interpretation that's going to be given to John by the angel or Jesus, whoever speaking at the time. And so that's probably the best way to take this. We don't have to. Symbols in the Bible don't always mean the same thing in every place where they occur, do they? And a great example of that is the lion. When we think of the lion, or at least when I think of the lion, the first person you think of is who?
Jesus.
Jesus. But who else is portrayed as a lion in the Bible? Satan. So there you go. Symbols can have very different meanings in the Bible. How do we decide? Thank you. All that does the pastor's part do. Look at the context. And 99 times out of 100, there'll be no question about what that symbol is saying. So, and of course, it could be literal. It could be that for some odd reason, based on the circumstances, he comes out of the sea. I don't know what those would be, and probably this is symbolic. He's a beast. They read on him, and it seems pretty obvious why he's called the beast. And he's rising up, and he has these 10 horns. Now, what do horns represent in the Bible?
Power.
Actually, it's power. Horns represent power. Like an animal with horn uses that horn as his offensive and defensive weapon. And the horns on the altar, they represent power. And so the fact that he has 10 horns is telling us that he's going to have great power, and 7 heads. That's confusing. 7 heads. What would be the symbol? What would be symbolized from the 7 heads? Do you think?
Maybe nations, kingship, because you alluded to the possible political chaos that might maybe leaders of nations, etc.
Okay, a lot of people take it that way, Cindy. That these 7 heads represent 7 individual rulers who are somehow part of the whole, the beast, whoever gets a hold of the world. Now, you could even take it as an organization. Some people take it so far as to say that there's not one individual Antichrist, that the Antichrist is symbolic of this organization that takes over the world. But I think there's enough evidence in the Bible here and in other places to say that while there's an organization with this man, that there's actually an individual too. Or as Greg said, it could be a woman, so we never know. Yeah. So 7 heads, we're not real sure, but if you haven't read ahead, you can read ahead to chapter 17. And some of these symbols are interpreted for John. But I'm not going to use that because I want to kind of let the book unfold on its own. I'll just let you know that if you want to look ahead. Because John doesn't tell us here. Jesus doesn't tell John. He lets them grapple with these symbols first. And so maybe we should also, instead of rushing to the end. So we have 7 heads, 10 horns, and 10 diadems. on the 7 horns, or on the heads. What are diadems?
Crown.
But they're political crowns.
They're political crowns. It's important for us to notice that because there are Stephanoi in the Revelation. Those are wreaths. And they're usually given to Christians. Diadems are, I don't think, ever given to a Christian in the book of Revelation. In fact, diadems eventually are given to whom? Jesus. Many diadems. And that brings a hymn. What is that hymn? Hymn?
Crown.
Is it crown for many crowns? Yeah, that's a good one. All right. So diadems, these are not just the wreath where you won a contest. This is somebody with political power. This is what a king would wear. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I thought, what I was gonna ask is, you said head, mine is horns. The
I
diadem on the horns.
I may have confused it. I
So I was
apologize.
thinking maybe the heads were political factions.
They wouldn't be factions in the sense that they're fighting with one another, I don't think, although that's possible. We just don't have enough detail to know. There's 10 diadems on the heads. If I said otherwise, I apologize. Excuse me. I'll get this right eventually. And on the horns of him, 10 diadems, and on the heads of him, names of blasphemy. Okay? Now, the blasphemy, that's going to come up over and over again. We know what that is. We know what that means. And so let's just continue on. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But verse 2, and the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet like a bear, and his mouth like a lion. And it was the dragon gave to him his power and his throne and great authority. Now, what's the significance of this leopard, bear, and lion language?
The beasts, the four beasts that Daniel, going back in Daniel, saw.
Okay, these are exactly the same beasts that Daniel saw. You mentioned 4. There are 4. There's only 3 here, and Daniel mentions these same 3. But in Daniel, they're separate. They come up individually. One comes up, and then he's destroyed, and another one comes up. And so they are successive empires in Daniel. Now, they all come together. Now, what seems to be said or implied here is that all of those great empires of history will be much smaller than this one. This will be a manifestation of all of them together, in a sense. If you can imagine what that looks like, and of course this is just symbolic language. And notice here what is implied in Daniel is said very clearly that it's the dragon who is whom? Satan. Satan is the one who is behind this beast, the Antichrist, giving him his power and his throne. That's interesting, isn't it? That Satan has a throne. So Satan has political power, and he gives it to this beast, and he gives him great authority. And so this is a reminder that the book of Daniel is important for our reading of Revelation. Daniel, this is from Daniel chapter 7. Actually, if you're not real familiar with it, you might want to go back later this evening or this week and read Daniel 7. Yes, sir. It doesn't say in Revelation he was, but it says so in other places in the Bible. Ephesians chapter 2 and other places, that he has been given a lot of power in this world, but it's limited. And that's part of what we're going to learn from the book of Revelation. Other questions? All right, verse 3. Now something very fascinating happens. In one of the heads, here's the way that he writes this. Okay, you can look and see how this is massaged in your English Bible. There's 4 words. The first word is hos, which means as. The second one is esphagmene, which means having been slain. Very, very literally. Having been slain. The next word is ice, which means into or unto. And the fourth word is thanaton, which means death. sound readable in English, but we want to do it in a way that is true to the idea which is being expressed in the Greek language. And that can be difficult sometimes. So what we have here, if I were going to read it very, very literally, directly from the Greek, would be, as having been slain into death. As having been slain into death. It's that word post or as that can be a little troublesome here. Because this word is used all through the book of Revelation. It's used frequently. Post, as. Over and over again, John says, and I saw something that looked post, as, looked like. And there's two ways to read the book of Revelation. One is to assume that John was actually seeing real events in the future, the way that they will appear when they happen. But that he was incapable of describing those events with his first century mind and vocabulary. And so what he did is he used these symbolic figures that he had in his mind to try to express what it was that he saw. That's one way to think about it. The second way to think about the book of Revelation is that what John saw was exactly what he's telling us he saw. That he saw all this bizarre stuff. That in chapter 9, when it said that a bunch of things that looked like locusts went out into the world, he wasn't talking about something that came from Lockheed Martin and just didn't know how to describe it. It was locusts, okay? And it's probably, it may be impossible for us to know exactly which, or to know which of those two that we should adopt. But it does kind of change the way that you think about the whole book. And if you've never heard somebody say that out loud, then you probably just assume one of those two and run with it. Now, I'm curious though. Somebody over here? Yes, ma'am.
But if it was Lotus, wouldn't you just say it was Lotus, not even like Lotus?
That's a good question. It may not actually be a locust. It could still be some huge animal thing flying through the air instead of a helicopter. And so there's no way we can actually pin it down, absolutely. And that's one of the maddening things about reading the book of Revelation. But that's a good question. But you think about that. Take that away. If you've never considered that, go away and think about that. I wonder which one it is. Did he see the actual events in the future? Or did he see these symbols? And even he had to grapple with the symbols to try to understand what they meant. All right, so verse 3, he uses that word as, which makes us wonder if this beast, this Antichrist, was really killed or not. But here's the thing, when he sees the Lamb in chapter 5, he says that he was standing post as one being slain. Now we know he was really slain, because that's Jesus, and Jesus died on the cross. And so that would be evidence for the idea that this beast also was really slain. That something happens and he is killed. And then the next thing that happens is it says, and the plague or something else of death, and from the plague of death he was healed. Now I'm using the word plague because that's one possible way to translate that word. Another way to look at it, wound. You could also use it as a wound. Either way, he could still die. But if it's a plague, maybe he died of some kind of illness. If it's a wound, then it may have been some kind of violence against him. Later in chapter 13, the word sword is going to be used. So I'll just go ahead and bring that up. So I'm reading ahead, which I sort of hate to do because I like to read the book the way it unfolds. It raises questions that sometimes are later answered, which makes you think about it and grapple with it. So at this point, we wouldn't know for sure. The reader, even the Greek reader, wouldn't know for sure. Well, what does he mean by that? Does he mean that he died from an illness, or does he mean that he was killed by an act of violence? Whichever it is at this point, he was healed from it. Now, the word for resurrection never occurs here. It's the words that sounds like our English word therapy, which way back then was a word for healing. So there's the evidence, again, and as it is often in the book of Revelation, leaves us asking a lot of questions. But what we do know is something really unusual happens to this individual, something that everyone in the world sees, that they're amazed at, and that in itself would seem to indicate that maybe that he was killed, and suddenly he's alive again. At least it's going to look like to everybody that he was killed. In verse 3, and the whole earth was amazed, literally after the beast. They were amazed at him. And then verse 4, and they worshipped the dragon. Now notice this, they're amazed at the beast, but they worship the dragon, which tells us what? They're not the same, but it tells us that the world at this point knows that the beast is backed up by the dragon. The world knows that the Antichrist is backed up by Satan. When they see what happens to the Antichrist, instead of worshiping the Antichrist, they worship Satan. And so the world has already been persuaded that Satan is in control and that he must be followed. Because I want you to look what happens here in verse 4. We're going to get our 6th and 7th questions of the 10 questions in the book of Revelation. And by the way, I've just got to give you, I'm just bursting with pride tonight. I've got to give you a little ad here. I've told you that I'm working on a book called The 10 Questions Answered in the Book of Revelation. And if you remember, I mentioned it, kind of expected it to be done by the end of this year, 2019. And it'll be small enough that we can print it out like we did the 40-day journey of prayer, and I can just give it to you, and you can read it, those of you that want to. Over the Christmas holiday, the Lord just got me stirred up, and I sat down and finished that book. Now, it's a rough draft, so I'll still have to do some polishing on it, but the whole thing is written really surprising. So I'm pretty excited, pretty pumped up about that. So you'll be hearing more about that as I get it ready and get it into your hands. But we come to these 6th and 7th questions here of the 10 questions in the book of Revelation. Verse 4, and they worshipped the dragon because he gave authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like the beast? Question number 6. And question number 7, who is able to do war against him? Now, let's think about these 2 questions for just a moment. Who is like the beast? Those of you who are biblical scholars and have read the Bible a lot, what does that immediately sound like? That sounds like something from the Old Testament. That's exactly right. You know, when the children of Israel came through the Red Sea, after they imagine all that they saw. You know, they saw the 10 plagues, they saw Pharaoh bow down and his army destroyed. They came through and they asked the question rhetorically in their praise, who's like the Lord? And that is a rhetorical question. They're not asking for someone to answer. What are they doing when they ask that question? It's just a way of making an assertion. What they're really saying is there is nobody like the Lord. The psalmist also asked that question in his praise. He says, who is like the Lord? And again, it's a rhetorical question, which means there is nobody like the Lord. And so this is stunning here, really, that this question comes up, who is like the beast? Because the people of earth now are doing what? They're beginning to equate the beast with God. The beast and the dragon, Satan and the Antichrist, they're beginning to treat him as if they are God. Notice in verse 4, and they worshipped. Now, this is striking to me as an observer of history. You would think that at the end of history, based on the way things are going right now, especially in the West, especially in the United States, you would think that at the end of history, religion would be what? Done away with. Absolutely. And there's plenty of evidence that the direction that we're moving in, at least in the West, is that religion is less and less important in people's lives. It's less and less important in public policy. It's just less and less important, period. So you would think that as we run history forward, that religion would just kind of disappear. And that's what atheists, especially those who have a Darwinian vision of the world, you know, maybe humanity needed to believe in God at some point in the past for whatever reason, but now we're getting so smart. You know, we're so impressed with ourselves that we don't need gods anymore. Now we can be like Nietzsche's Superman. We can finally, once and for all, say that there's no meaning to life. There's no life after death. Nothing here really matters, but we're going to live anyway and do it with gusto. You know, that is, I just described about 80% of the movies that you watch, by the way, because this is an underlying philosophy that's being promoted, not just through Hollywood, but through a lot of different venues. And by the way, for those of us who have younger people in our homes, we need to help them be able to see that, or seep into their spirits, and they'll begin to pick up on that idea that to be a mature member of the race means that you reach the point where you cast off the chains of religion and so forth. So it's surprising here to come to the end of time and find what? A world religion. Absolutely, yes, ma'am.
Don't you think that we still need someone to bring us peace?
Well, Kathleen's asking a good question, and I brought up a subject that we could probably talk about for a long time. If you take away religion from people, they'll replace it with something else. But it is true that atheism has been far more militant and aggressive in promoting the idea that we can live a good life, that we can live a meaningful, purposeful life, even though there is no final definition of good, and that ultimately there's no purpose or meaning to life. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds bizarre. They talk to us about being disconnected from reality. To me, that's the ultimate disconnection from reality, to say, my life is meaningless, but I'm going to pretend that it has meaning. Who's disconnected from reality? Well, the final analysis, whether God's there or not, will tell us the question. But we know He is, and so we're not disconnected from reality when we say that there is a meaning, there is a purpose, and worship should be part of it. So it's surprising here to come to the end. It might be to Westerners, but it wouldn't be to people in Africa. It wouldn't be to people in South America. It wouldn't be to people in India. It wouldn't be to people, in fact, in most of the world. In fact, the statistics globally show that religion is, guess what? It is advancing. It is not moving back. Only in the West does religion look like it's dying out. The rest of the world, religion and Christianity particularly, is flourishing. And that might be another indication, unfortunately for us, that the Western culture is what? It is dying. That Western culture may be getting ready to step off of the stage of world history. We don't know. We'll have to watch and see. These things don't happen overnight, usually. But the point here is that religion will be alive and well at the end of time. And the dragon, Satan, doesn't try to get rid of religion. Satan doesn't want to stand out with religion. What does he want? He wants to be the center of it. Absolutely. Satan loves religion. He loves worship. As long as it's all pointed at him. And that's his goal. And there's also a practical reason for keeping religion alive. If you're trying to be an empire builder, if you're trying to be the next Alexander the Great or whoever, there's a practical reason for using religion. What is it? Power, control. There's It gives everybody a commonality. It's common sense. It's a common sense of worth, purpose, a common set of values, and it glues people together. What has glued cultures and societies together in the past has been a common worldview. And he understands that. Most empire builders have. By the way, we've had some, recently we've had some junior antichrists who have been pretty good. 20th century had at least 3 junior antichrists. Who were they? Yeah, Castro, Tito, they're kind of Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong is somebody who brought terror to a huge part of the population of the world. Constantly, when you think about China, you got to remember that about 1 in 7 people who live on planet Earth are in China. That's a huge bite out of the population. So whatever happens in China really is big. Who else?
Bin Laden.
Adolf Hitler. Certainly, he makes the list. You know.
Joseph Stalin.
Stalin. Yeah, and I would also maybe add Pol Pot, but he was a little more regional. But he was super evil. These guys who are working their way toward the Antichrist, they're people who bring evil to the whole world. And we're naming some that have done that. So these are just indications that there are people that are moving toward fulfilling this, and eventually one of them is going to click. It's all going to come together and happen, and he will be the beast. All right, question back in the back, Jordan.
No, I didn't. I was gonna say like either like Bin Laden or Charles Manson.
No. Those are very wicked and evil people. Joseph Smith, others, he affected a lot of people. But we're talking about a worldwide leader who is not just a leader, a religious leader, but also a political leader. So that there are very specific things that have to come together to make these individuals. What about these questions? So who is like the beast? Has the book of Revelation already answered this question?
Yes.
I would say that it has. I would say that when in chapter 1, when John said, I turned around to see the voice that was speaking to me. And when I turned around, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and one like the Son of Man walking among the lampstands with dressed in a white robe, reaching down to his feet, with a golden sash around his chest, his head and his hair white like wool, as white. And he goes on and he gives this incredible description of the glorified Lord Jesus Christ. Then, when John is transported to heaven and has a vision of the throne in heaven in chapters 4 and 5, he sees again Jesus, who is the only one who is worthy to take the scroll from the hand of the one sitting on the throne and break its seals. Remember all of that? So he is, and there he is, the Lamb who was slain, and yet he's standing. He is the root of David. He is the Lion from the tribe of Judah. And so these descriptions of Jesus have already answered this question, and the people on earth should have known it. Believers at this time will know it. They will know that despite what they see of the power of the beast, that there is somebody who is stronger. And look at the next question, and who can do war with him? Now that question is going to be answered later in the book. It's going to be answered in chapters 14 and 19. So I'm out of time, so I'll stop, and we'll kind of pick up with that next time, that 7th question. Yes, ma'am?
2, 5, 6.
These are 6 and 7. Yeah. You probably haven't been doing this, but let's run through it real quick. First question was, who is worthy? Who is worthy to take the book and to open its seals? And what was the answer? Jesus, the Lamb, the Lion from the tribe of Judah. The second question was, how long? How long, God, are you going to let this go on? And what was the answer to that question?
No, wait.
It's a little bit longer, but specifically it's until the last part is killed, and then things change. Then the next question was, who can stand? The people on earth. This was another rhetorical question. They said, who can stand before God? And what they really mean to say is what? God is mean. He's horrible. Nobody can stand before him. Rocks follow us. Hills cover us. They just want to die and not ever have to face God at all. But that question is answered in the next two questions, where John sees a great multitude in heaven, and an angel comes up to him and he says, "Who are these?" And John says, "I don't know. You do. You tell me." And he tells him, he says, "These are the ones who have washed their robes in the blood of the Lamb." And they are, by the way, standing before God. So they're doing the very thing that these people said couldn't be done. And they can't be counted. They're so numerous. So not only can it be done, but a lot of folks are going to do it. How do you do it? Well, washed by the blood of the Lamb. And then he asks, where are they from? And the answer is that they come from the Great Tribulation. And that raises questions about how to interpret the book. But undoubtedly, whether you believe the church is taken out before the Great Tribulation or not, there are believers who, in the Great Tribulation, are killed for their faith. And that's where these come from. So those are your first 5 questions. Here's the next 2. And we'll look at the answer to number 7. Not next week, because next week we're going to be talking about buildings. If we get that done in time, we'll talk about this, but I kind of doubt it. I think we'll take us a whole hour at least. But that'll be fun. So come and be a part of that. Appreciate you being here tonight. Thank you for your attention and your patience. And I always enjoy the time that we have together in God's Word. Let's pray.